Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Once again, I welcome each one of you for our today's webinar on business process architecture. Salam alaikum, Tariq. Thank you for your wishes. I'm good. I'm glad to see that most of the delegates are joining us from our webinar 1 onwards and few from webinar 2. We all are, it's look like we are becoming a small community here. So let's continue our journey from confusion to clarity. And today we are at milestone 3 with our episode 3. A quick recap of last 2 webinars where we discussed, in webinar 1, we discussed about the concepts starting from what is business process management, how it is linked with business excellence frameworks, digital journey of an organization. And in last webinar, webinar 2, we discussed about essentials of business process management, like principles of primacy, 7 enablers of process management, process maturity, how process development and continuous improvement should integrate together and why. Recording of our last 2 webinars are available on our website. If you find any problem, please feel free, write to us and we will provide you the required information, link and the information. So to continue our journey with our today's session, I once again welcome Mr. Roger Tregear for the continuation of our webinar series. In BPM world, Roger does not need much introduction. He's well recognized as a global guru on BPM and author of many books. Today's session is divided actually into 2 parts. In the first part, Roger is going to present the concept of business process architecture, followed by open question and answer session. That is our part 2, to keep it more interactive and to discuss something which is more useful for us. So all for this session. Roger? Roger?
Okay, thank you, Amit. Just confirm you can hear me okay, because I was having some sound problems there for a moment.
No, I can hear you loud and clear, Roger.
Okay, that's good. It was probably just coming this way. So thank you for that. And hello to everyone. Good to be talking to you again about my favorite topic, and I hope yours, process-based management. We want to talk today about business process architecture, and this is the keystone artifact of our process-based management. If we don't have good process-based, to get good process-based management happening, we really do need to have our process architecture as a sound operational document. So just briefly recapping where we were before, you can see in the center of our screen, we've got the circles, and this is our meta model for process management. We're setting targets, we're assessing performance, we're assessing ideas, we're deciding what to do about that, and if we need to, we're going to intervene and take some action to make a change in the process because we want it to do something different or because it's not doing what it is we want it to do. We enable that to happen with the 7 enablers, and the key part of all of that is the process architecture that we'll look at in this session. So let's get stuck in. What is a process architecture? Well, here's a picture of a process architecture. Obviously, it's a simplified one, and it's just in a set of basic diagrams, but it gives us the basis of a process architecture. It's a real one, by the way. It comes, as you might gather, from a hospital project we did long ago. A bit of basic geography of the way I set up a process architecture anyway. You'll see at the top shared management processes. These are the processes that are really to do with strategic management. At the bottom, shared support processes, and they're the processes that keep the wheels moving, keep the lights turned on, keep us all employed, etc. So they're the enabling processes, sometimes called down the bottom, management or strategic processes, strategic management processes at the top, and then and those processes, management and support, are pretty common across lots of organizations, perhaps every organization. Because everyone does some IT and procurement and legal and financial, everyone has a strategy, etc. Sometimes, often, you'll find 1 or 2 that are specific to an organization. So if you look at the support processes there down the bottom, third from the right, you'll see minimize infection risk. That's a big deal in a hospital, not in your organization, I hope, if you're not in a hospital. So some particular ones, but maybe 95% of management and support processes are common across all of our organizations. But in the middle, we have what I call the core processes. Now, these are the processes that are directly translating our strategy into products and services delivered to customers and other stakeholders. So these are the processes who make us who we are, and they are going to be different. I guess they'd be similar between hospitals, but between different organizational types, they'll be quite different. And we'll talk soon about how we come to discover those. So this is the highest level view of the hospital. And by the way, that's a picture of everything the hospital does. Obviously, there's lots more levels to the architecture and lots of detail, but process architecture at the top level is a picture of everything it does, not just part of it. Now, you'll see one of the processes there, the core processes, is called care for patients. Not a surprise, it's a hospital. And the point of having an architecture is that we can do this kind of thing. So this is our process still, care for patients. You can see there, top left corner. That's what I call a level 0 processor, the top level, the highest level of the core processes. And in this diagram, we're simply showing another 2 levels of process architecture. So the highest level is care for patients. The next level down is called level 1 here, the yellow boxes, and then the white boxes are the sub-processes of the yellow boxes. So that's a pretty comprehensive view all of a sudden of care for patients. And obviously we can go up and down, and we can go down further, of course, as we need to. But immediately, without any reference to the organizational structure and who does what, we now have a view of this part of the organization, anyway, as a set of processes. This is what it does. And you can see there that there's a kind of patient life cycle there, from register to discharge and provide aftercare. But every part of the organization of the hospital gets involved in delivering these processes. Some more than others, of course, but that's the whole point of the exercise. We now just have this picture, very useful picture of the organization as a set of processes. So how do we do that? How do we build such a thing? Well, it takes a couple of weeks, so we can't go through the whole thing in detail now, but I can give you some very good specific guidelines, because I think this is not so hard to do. Firstly, when I'm doing this, I always want to start with the organizational strategy. And I mean literally with the vision, mission, purpose statement, objectives, whatever the form it takes in your organization. Whatever that is, we want to start with that. So we start with the strategy and a blank sheet of paper, as it were. And what we want to know is, what is it we promised to do in the strategy? Sometimes we call this the value propositions for the organization. What is it that we promise to do, and to whom? Because it's our highest level processes that will deliver on those promises. So we have lots of conversation about the strategy. Now, if you don't have a written strategy, that's okay. You can still have the conversation, because you're just talking to a group of people, different groups of people, and saying, what is it we do here? Why do you come to work? What does good look like? What are the services you offer? You have those kinds of conversations, and we can map that then into those highest level processes. And then we can decompose those processes down a couple of levels. I say 2 levels here, not because you stop there, of course, you keep going when you need to, but I'm just assuming we're starting without an architecture. So having 3 levels in the initial architecture is good. That's at least hundreds of processes. So we've got plenty to do there. And then, of course, you'll drill down deeper when you need to, when you've got some problem to fix, or you want to understand something better. We do the same thing for management and support processes. When I'm doing this, I have a reference model that I'm happy to use for management and support. I never ever use reference models for core processes. Unless it's a very, very specific model of core processes that applies to your organization perfectly, But the problem I have with reference model for core processes is by definition, they're someone else's processes. And they're not in your language, they don't reflect conversation that you've had. So, but management and support processes are pretty common, so I don't mind doing that. And now the work just begins. We've got a good working version of it. Now we need to expose that to lots of people. We need to put it on the screens, put it on the wall, get lots of people talking about it, and there'll be debate, there'll be argument. Some people won't like it. Some people will come up with good ideas, and it will evolve over time. And we're not looking to get it to be perfect before we start using it. That would take forever. And it will keep changing over time. It just needs to be good enough for us to use it as a management tool. And by the way, I think that depends on the organization and the status of the strategy and whatever, but it's like maybe, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks of elapsed time. And that's not full-time workshops. That's lots of workshops, but then lots of one-to-one conversations and presentations and discussions. Because the organization's got to own it, particularly the management decision makers have got to buy into this, because we want it to be an important management tool. And if they don't buy into it, then we've just created another poster to stick on the wall for a while and then everyone will forget about it. So we've got to make it real. Okay, so let's just do that. Here's a simple exercise. We can't go through it in huge detail, but this is an actual project. This was for a university. Now, as I say, we start with the strategy. Now, the strategy had a bit more to it than this in terms of the documentation, but we started having conversations with them about what the vision and mission meant and the purpose statement, and they had quite a bit of documentation about what their strategy was. So we just started saying, okay, what does that mean? What does this mean? And we get to this as a sort of, think of these as 3 value propositions, if you like. So then we take each of these and we said, okay, well, there's some fancy words, the sort of stuff you see on posters, isn't it? Develop globally focused graduates, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so we talk about that with various groups, and the workshops really are about having conversations about, what do you mean by that? You know, what actually happens? What's good about this? I mean, you teach people, I guess, and we got a room full, maybe 5 or 10 people, and we're having conversations. And at this university, we had large groups and lots of workshops. But we have those conversations, and we get around to the point of saying, okay, well, one of our highest level core processes, let's call it produce graduate. Now, it's not as easy as click, because this is lots of meetings and discussions. I ran this project and I thought it was going to be something like teach students. Seemed reasonable. But the conversation was about, well, we're not just here to teach, we want to produce a graduate. We don't just teach courses. So produce graduate. And you have these conversations and they'll go round and round in circles. And then at some point, someone will say, what about, it might have previously said develop graduate. No, it's not, graduate's good, but we don't like develop. And then someone will say, what about produce? What about produce graduate? And you get some sense of something's happened when everything goes quiet in the room. Yeah, produce graduate, that's what we need. Anyway, so we do the same thing. So this second one is about research. And I remember clearly when it was first written up, the first thing I wrote up as an idea for this, it was called do research. That didn't sound too good. So then it was enable research, all sorts of things we went through. And by the way, all of these processes are in the format verb noun, do something to something. Important rule to follow, I think. And then the last one is about being a good community, good corporate citizen. We had interesting conversations about what that means. So we had this extended conversation to come up with, from the value proposition, to come up with the highest level core processes. That's a big step. Now we're started, okay. And it takes a little longer than just one click, as I just did then, but now we turn that into the architecture. So you'll see at the top, lead the university, support the university. That's a common way of encapsulating the management and support processes. And then we've got the core processes in the middle. Produce graduate turned into 2 highest level core processes, coursework graduates and research graduates. And that's that university's terminology for postgraduate and undergraduate. And we had long conversation about whether we needed one or two, and obviously we decided we needed two. So, and then you take each of those highest level core processes and you say, what are the sub processes? How do they start? How do they finish? What happens in between? More workshops. Now we start to get down further and further, and then as we get down further, we need many more specialist people, real subject matter experts in the narrower areas. So the workshops are always tailored to have the right people in them. Lots of conversation going on, lots of reporting back to the rest of the organisation, etc. So that's how we do it. I mean, it sounds simple because it is. It takes a little longer than that, but it just requires the right people in the right room and the right facilitation just to move that along. And we'll have lots of conversations and we have a few arguments, and some people feel a bit challenged by all of this sometimes, but we just need to work our way through that. And at some point, everyone starts smiling. Here's another one. Now, not too many of us on the listening to this, I think, would be able to read that, but I guess some of you can. For those of us who can't, let me just change it for you. This is a process architecture for the telecommunications and IT regulator in Saudi Arabia, CITC. I can use this picture, by the way, with permission, because it's one that was used in 2018 in a public series of presentations in the US and in London. And by now it's well out of date, but it's a good example. Again, we've got lead and support at the lead at the top, support at the bottom. If you're following closely, you'll see that there's quite an overlap between the university's management processes and CITC's. And then in the middle there, we've got four lovely core processes: highest level, motivate the market, empower users, assure infrastructure and technology, safeguard national resources. Lots of conversation to come up with those to derive that out of the architecture. And that's a very different view. I like this picture because it's a very different view than you'd get if you were looking at the organization chart for CITC. And that's a thing that's quite startling for people sometimes, because this is a different perspective of the organization. So there are two examples, well, several so far. Now, one of the things that people do, by the way, don't forget, if you've got questions, put them in the Q&A, or perhaps they're coming in the chat. I'm not seeing that, but put them in the Q&A and we'll catch up with those soon. Some people like to produce their process architecture by starting at the bottom and working up. I'll tell you immediately, I think this is a bad idea, and I don't think it works very well, and it takes a long time. So, but the way it's done is that you would go around to the various departments at the lowest level of the organization chart, if you like, and you'd say, what are the things you do? And you make a list of all the things people do. And then you aggregate those upwards. It's a kind of affinity mapping kind of thing to say, you know, we've got a whole bunch of processes down the bottom, hundreds, if not thousands of them. Let's say it's a bunch of post-it notes on the wall. Let's start merging those upwards somehow. Now, the problem with that is that you've got no hope at all of merging those upwards and finding yourself reflecting strategy. Some bits of it will touch on strategy, but that's just a fluke. Or it's some remnant of the organization chart coming through into strategy. But there's no direct relationship between strategy and process if you started at anywhere but strategy. To do it this way also takes a long time. It's tedious, people hate it, and it doesn't give you a good result. So why would you bother? So start from the top, work down. It's quicker, it gives a better result, it's good fun. Why wouldn't you do it that way? Okay, let's be clear. If we had a great process architecture, what are we going to do with it? What is the point? And the point is not to just build another picture to hang on the wall. You know, that's not a known business problem, is it, that we don't have a process architecture poster? So if we've got one, what would we do? Well, obviously, it'll give us a picture of the organization as a set of processes. What are the processes by which we execute our strategy? That's not a vague question anymore. We've got an answer. Here they are, hundreds of them. or 20 or 30 at the top level. Here's the big picture. If you want to focus the organization on value delivery, well, there's nothing better than a process architecture, because the process architecture is all about delivering value to customers and other stakeholders. They're the questions we ask to start with. What do we promise? What did we say we'd deliver? How do we deliver that? So the architecture is built around that question, answering that question. When we start doing various process improvement projects on different processes, of course, the process architecture gives us a canvas on which we can track all of that. It also gives us a structure in which we can report. We can build all of our process models. We can report. We've got a structure now to which we can communicate process information. Of course, it's also allowing us to see some interdependencies, all of the interdependencies between our processes. We tend to talk about and draw pictures of processes as a, at best a two-dimensional matrix, but it's an n-dimensional ecosystem, really. Every process has relationships with many others, and we need to get a handle on that, and the architecture helps us do that. This is not just about process improvement either. It's about picking up new ideas. The respond node there in the PO circle, it's not just about measure, it's about assessing new ideas as well. So where would the best innovations come from? Which area do we need to innovate to get the best overall result? And sometimes last on the list there, but maybe it's even the most important because it's sometimes an unintended consequence, but if you want to develop a collaborative culture in the organization, then get lots of groups together regularly to talk about how they collaborate. Have discussions, have arguments about how they collaborate. But what is the horizontal view of the organization? Now we actually start to understand which piece we produce across the organization. One last point I want to make, important concept. I touched on it before, but I really want to make it clear that the organization chart is a totally different thing to the process architecture. They both start with strategy, and as I've just said, we derive process architecture from the strategy. Absolutely, no doubt about it. You will also derive an organization chart from strategy, and sometimes the org chart is directly mapped to objectives or parts of the strategy, sometimes not so obvious. But even if that's the case, they're totally different things. And I go to the trouble, for example, when we're doing those high-level, first couple of levels of process, particularly in the core, I try very hard to not use terms in the process architecture that you'd find in the organization chart, because I don't want there to be any confusion about them. And also, people will often say, they'll look at the process architecture and they'll say, where's my department? And that's a great opportunity for you to say, it's not there and it's not meant to be. So, the process architecture is telling us what we do. The org chart is effectively saying who does it. And the strategy, of course, is telling us why we do it. And that's why we need to keep them separate. They're all useful, but separate, totally separate views. Okay, so that's a quick run through. We'll have some conversation in a minute, but just very briefly, we build the process architecture, multiple levels. It gives us a picture of the whole organization as a set of processes. And we want to do that because then that gives us a management tool. You can see, and this is what we'll get into in the next webinar next week, but how do we use that? Well, we start for a particular process, we'll pick one and then we'll start identifying KPIs, we'll start tracking performance, we'll start setting targets, we'll start using it as an active management tool. But for now, we want to talk about how we get this most important of all the artifacts together, the process architecture. That's all I needed to say. I'll hand back to Amit and he's going to facilitate us through. I see there's a bunch of questions come in. He'll have a few himself, no doubt. So back to you, Amit. Mute. Yep.
Is it better? I'm audible, Roger?
Yep,
Am I audible, Roger?
Yes.
All right. So few questions that I can see are available with us. First one is from Matthew. He has asked, can we use an architecture to we demonstrate process connections and how value accumulate through multiple processes to achieve business outcomes?
Yes, I hope that's exactly how we use it. It's certainly how we build it, isn't it? Because we first say, what are the high level outcomes? And then what's the process that's going to do it? And then you could take each of those processes at any level, particularly when you come to do the sub-processes, and you could say, okay, who is it, which part of the organization is actually executing that part of the process? Because if you took, care for patients, for example, that's a very high level process, but then you can put that down into that patient life cycle. Let me just pull that up here on the screen. Everything from registration through to all the medical stuff, through to discharging with finance and IT and everyone involved along the way. So now you can start to say, okay, we've got KPIs for care for patients. Is it working? Are we on track? Is everything, predictable? Is it stable? Is it on target? And if it's not, then you can drill down to find out where the problem is, etc. So the whole point, I think, of having an active process management, nicely modeled in something, I'm using PowerPoint here, of course, which is not a modeling tool, but nicely modeled, something useful that allow you to drill up and down and see where the actual issues are very quickly, that cross-functional view. So I hope that's exactly what we're doing for that.
So
what else have we got there? Is that next?
Okay. Next question again from Matthew is asked about, can we make it clear how support service process relate to core business processes? Is there a way that we can use process architecture to help people see how it all works and break down silos mentality?
Yes, indeed. So I won't go into detail of this because we won't have time, but it's part of what we're going to cover next week. It's a thing called, that I find anyway useful, that I call a context diagram, called a scope diagram in some places. And you say, here's our process. Now, which other processes does it relate to? Kind of think of a SIPOC diagram, if you know what that is, and then say, where does all the inputs and outputs come from and go to? So once you've got a good picture of the organization as a set of processes, particularly if you've got a nice repository-based modeling tool, then you can start building all of those connections. And that's a very powerful and useful thing to do. Yeah, so for sure, this is, you're asking all the right questions, Andrew, and yes, we can do all of this, and that's the point of the exercise.
Okay. Perfect. Roger, one question is also on a similar line. If we have more than one line of business with many management and support processes common and core processes are different, how do we develop an architecture for the same? Does it mean we need to have one architecture, multiple architecture?
Okay. So the first question, I said we start with strategy, but the first thing to do when you're doing it for real is to make sure you know which organization you're talking about. So, that's usually pretty obvious. If it's a hospital, it's a hospital. If it's a university, it's a university. But you might be talking about a corporate group that's a group of companies, and maybe they're doing something very different. They might be in healthcare, they might be in manufacturing, they might be in real estate management. And if they're very separate businesses, then they'll obviously, there is probably a case to make for having separate architectures totally. Certainly the core processes are going to be different. Now, I went back to this picture you've got on the screen just to point out, you notice there it says for the hospital, shared management processes and shared support processes. Now it says shared because they're shared across the core. Right, all of those processes have impact, on there. So if you've got management or support processes that are not shared, that work only for a particular core process, then they wouldn't appear in the shared. They turn up in the lower levels of the core process. So, which organisation are we talking about? What are the boundaries of the organisation? Is it just one or is it many? How many overall architectures are we going to build is what you'll decide from that question. If you have very different lines of business, then you're certainly going to have different high-level core processes. You might even have separate architectures. You might, though, even if you've got separate organizations, they might have genuinely physically shared support services. You know, shared IT, shared finance, etc. Or they mightn't have it at that at the moment, but perhaps that's where they're headed towards. And you might use the whole process analysis to say, okay, we've got 5 different organizations here. How could we have just one finance department rather than 5 departments? So yeah, which organization are we talking about, and be clear about the boundaries, and then what's shared and what's not shared is important.
Mm-hmm. Roger, we are getting some question on chat. Can I request all the delegates to please raise all your questions in question and answer? That will be easier and will be helpful for us to stick on to one.
You mean not in chat, but in Q&A.
Yes, not in chat, but in Q&A. Roger, another question is about that you mentioned about the reference architecture, which you rarely use for core processes. Starting from nothing, make it really hard to position the possible within an organization. What are your thoughts?
No, I don't think it's hard at all. And I've done this for many organizations, and I'm not interested in the possible, because what I want to do is know what you promise in the strategy. And we have those conversations, and we'll get something like you're seeing on the screen for the hospital. We took no notice at all of the organization chart. We had some vague idea what a hospital's for. Thank God I've not had much to do with them, but we all have some idea. It's a teaching hospital, which is why we've got those other processes in there. The 2 in the middle, but we didn't have to have possibles. I think if you start with a list of possibles and you say, here are 25 possible processes, do you have any of these? It's like that, trying to do it from the bottom, and people will go through and they'll tick the box and say, yeah, we've got those 5, okay. But there's someone else's processes. You didn't have a debate about them. There's not necessarily a conversation about what to kill them, I think it's important to actually have that conversation. So I don't find it a problem at all not to have any possibles to start with, because I genuinely start with the strategy and a blank, flip chart or whiteboard or whatever it is to build the strategy. And I think that's the best thing to do.
Some questions are regarding tools also, Roger. Like, would you say tools like business model, canvas, strategy map, or some sophisticated tool like ERP tool will be useful to create a process architecture?
Did you say ERP in there?
Yeah, some tools to create the architecture, or use some sophisticated tools. So one way, in one of the questions, it is mentioned even for the ERP. But do you think a tool is mandatory to use for business process architecture, and some tools like strategy tools are also important?
So if the organization has a good sense of its strategy, if it's already done the strategic planning exercise using canvases and balanced scorecards and whatever else it's done, then it's going to say, this is our vision, mission, or purpose, objectives, whatever the terminology is. That's our starting point. So when we're building a process architecture, that's the work that follows on from the strategy. And for a process architecture development team, it's not our job to change the strategy either, by the way. We'll have lots of questions of people to say, okay, what do you mean by that? The university example, the classic case was engaged society and industry. We had some conversations. Okay, what do you mean by that? What do you actually do? And it turned out they didn't do much at all, but someone had said it was really important. So you have those kind of conversations, but it's not our job to change it. And the tools that I use, I say, is a pen and paper, a pen and whiteboard. I mean, that's where we start. Obviously, then it's got to get into a modelling tool, and then the deeper down you get, the more and more detailed you're getting, and the less and less cross-functional it's getting. So, but not to start. You don't need a tool to start. You just need to know why you come to work and something to write on.
Yeah. Rather, in fact, business process management architecture is a concept, right, which gives a clarity about how the strategies are getting executed. Tools are not mandatory. Even Excel or a PowerPoint has been used by various organizations. Nevertheless, some tools can ease the entire work and the entire journey. So depending on the organization, their readiness or the maturity, they can plan it. But indeed, Excel, white paper or sheets are good enough to start with your architecture work.
Yep. Yeah, sure. I mean, you can't manage hundreds of processes or even perhaps even many tens of processes in PowerPoint. That's not the point. But when you're first building it, and I'm just talking about the first, couple of weeks maybe of the project to build the process architecture, then, it's more about presentation than about modeling.
Yeah.
We're naming processes, that's all. But yeah, certainly at the point where you've got, to this kind of point, as we see on the screen here, then someone's got to take that and put it into a modeling tool. And I don't mean a drawing package when I say a modeling tool. I mean, I'm not the technologist. I'm not here to give recommendations about what tools, but I mean something that's database driven, that's got a repository, not just a drawing package, because that's no better than not a lot better than PowerPoint. We want to be able to, we want everything in our architecture to be an object in a database, essentially. So.
Mm-hmm. Great.
So what do we got there next?
Roger, next question is about where does the how question sit in relation to process architecture, organization architecture, and strategy? We talked about why, yeah.
Okay, this is a sort of terminology people have different meanings about, but if we're talking about how we do things, then I think that's the process view, is it not? If that's what we're meaning by how. If an organizational architecture, that's a dangerous term as well. If that's the organization chart, then that's, we need an org chart. We're not replacing it. We need to know who reports to who and how we group people of like skills and like objectives and where the authorities and delegations are. That's an important thing to have. And strategy is how we derive the process architecture. I mean, so we have all of those things. One's not replacing the other, and we maintain them all, I think.
Yep. So next question is about at L1, do you advocate building a value stream style processes that cut across organization structure, or a functional decomposition of each function?
No, certainly not functional, no. No, I mean, what we're trying to do here, we've got plenty of idea of how the organization works in a functional sense. But you think about the organization chart, every organization's got one. We've got the university on the hospital on the screen. So, sorry, the university on the screen. So let's talk about that. That university had 7 faculties, multiple campuses, all the usual stuff, tens of thousands of students. So we knew a lot about that, but in every organization we know that we get work done by collaboration across the organization. So that's across the organization chart. So, and in most organizations that's not being managed. We manage up and down, but not across. So the point of process-based management is to fix that horizontal vision problem. So when we're producing the process architecture, it's very cross-functional. We don't care about the organization chart at all. I don't even like to have one in the room because it's not relevant. We start at the top. What is it? Okay, we're going to produce graduates. Okay, how do we do that? How does that start? How does it finish? What happens in between? Now, it's true, of course, that as you come deeper and deeper into a process architecture, lower and lower levels, the cross-functional nature of a process is going to get smaller and smaller until at some level, the process is defining a function or perhaps even a person's job. So as we get deeper into an architecture, it becomes less cross-functional. But I'm certainly not talking about creating some sort of functional processes. That's what you get if you start at the bottom and try and come up, because you lock in that siloed view of the organization. And we want to have a cross-functional view. So no functions, which is why, as I said, I even like to avoid using words that gets used on the organization chart at the higher levels of the process architecture. You can't always do it, but it's good to try just to make the point.
Okay.
It's also why we also want to have all of our processes named in that verb-noun way. Every process you've seen on every screen I've shown you has processes in that verb-noun way. Establish need, design course, progress student, do something to something. And in that form, it's highly unlikely to appear on the org chart as well. Yep. How are we doing for time? Another few minutes, have we?
Yes, and we have 21 questions left, Roger.
Okay, well, that's some homework for me.
So some questions are regarding the process frameworks like ITIL, or people have even asked about, do you have some examples of public sector process frameworks, or do you think how this ITIL process framework fits into this architecture? Okay,
so there are lots of process frameworks. Let me answer the public sector one first. I don't know why there isn't one, because so much of the public sector between departments in different countries around the world is reasonably common. You know, it's about producing policy and implementing policy, and, you know, there should be a model. I forget exactly what it's called, but I can put it in the notes that we send out. The Canadian government did a reference model at one time. I'll get some details of that, but I've never found lots of government process model work, and we've done some serious research to try and find out what's in the literature. Now, but there are lots of models out there. Many organizations, of course, may have models that they don't publish because they think they're strategically valuable. We can't know what we can't know. But something like, if you took ITIL, for example, or COBIT, or any of these other sorts of models, you would find a home for that at some level of, we're looking at the university where the support process, you'll see there it's called maintain ICT systems. That's their terminology. Somewhere down there, or perhaps replaced entirely by that, you could use perhaps ITIL, but certainly COBIT or something like that. And if that's the case, then if you're comfortable with all of those processes, then do it. Because you can get reference models, you can buy the process models. Your modeling tool probably has a file you can buy that just plugs them in, and then you start with that. You get benchmark data. There's lots of advantages to that. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. If there's a good, solid, viable process model, then use it. And as we're starting this, of course, every organization already has lots of process models. But we're not looking at those to start with. We'll start at the top and come down, and at some point, we'll be able to plug in our existing process models, maybe with some changes. Sorry, long answer.
Okay. Roger, some of the questions are regarding the components for architecture. What are the information that we should put on architecture? So a few of the questions are related to, should we put or mention inputs and resources, KRAs also onto architecture?
Okay, so once you've built the architecture, if you get to the stage where we're seeing here, and maybe one more level for the things we've seen for the hospital and for the university, once you get to this point and you've put it into a proper modeling tool, now you've got an unlimited number of attributes you could collect for every object that you see. And it would be fantastic if you built your model repository as the centerpiece of managing your processes. So yes, you can go in there for, discharge patient, and you could collect all the performance stats. You could have information there about who's involved, how many people, what sort of people. You could have complaint data, any kind of data that you want to do there, costs, everything. So the architecture is not just giving you this nice picture, it's giving you an active management tool, a home for every bit of information you might want to collect about the way you get stuff done.
Okay. Roger, one question is about how do you measure the effectiveness of process architecture? How do we measure the lead lag indicators from architecture?
So, I mean, the good question is, how do we measure the effectiveness of these process people who tell us we should be running efficient and effective processes? Again, we'll touch on this next week. We talk about active process management, but there is a process of process improvement, isn't there? I'm not sure if it's actually shown in any of these. Let me just go back to, oh yes, you see that process up there. We're here at the hospital, improve performance. Now, that's got lots of layers beneath it, and that's the process of process management and improvement. The process owner for that process would be the person running the office of BPM, or the process center of excellence, or whatever it's called. Right? So that's got to have some KPIs and some targets, and it's got to report its performance, and bound into all of that is how effective is process management being. Part of that's about the architecture, of course, and you might want to know how often it's used and, all that kind of thing. But there is a process in there somewhere, a sub-process that says maintain process architecture. Okay, there's a process. How will we know whether that's working? What will be the KPIs for a process, maintain process architecture? Collect the data. Is it good? Is it useful? Should we sack ourselves? They're the kind of questions. So, that process improved process performance might be, perhaps that should be the best process we have.
Okay. Well, a few questions are related to the levels of information that we should maintain in process architecture. So there are different thoughts, different concepts behind how many levels we need to maintain, and on each level, what type of information we should maintain about the process information. So can you share something about this also?
Yep. Okay, so my general view of this is that if you were starting from a blank sheet, as I've said, I come down 3 levels. So we've got the highest level, and then down 1, down 2. Now, that's not to say that that's where we stop, of course. My challenge, though, to anyone is to say, drill down as deep as you like, but I would only go down further if I've got some problem to fix, some opportunity to test, or there's something I don't understand. Now, if I've got a problem at, say level 3, often I need to define level 4 just so I can properly understand level 3, which is really why we do 3 levels to start with. But I think there is no requirement, doesn't make sense to me to say, we'll take the entire architecture down to level 6, 7, 8. What's the point? It's the same as I think we mentioned this in our last webinar, but it's the same as when people say we're going to model all of our processes. What for? So we're going to do stuff for a purpose. Do it just in time, not just in case. There are some of these processes in the architecture that will never get a lot of active management. That must be true. There's hundreds, if not thousands, depending on what level you're at. And we're not managing thousands of processes individually. And it's also true that if a process is working, say a level 2 process, if it's working well enough, you've got good KPIs, everyone's happy, it's stable, running nicely, then you can reasonably assume that the lower level processes are also running well enough. Doesn't mean you couldn't improve something down there, but you'd have to make sure there was a business case for it, because at the higher level of those processes, we're not seeing a problem. So, what's the problem you're trying to fix? We've got to be careful about that. So I think I'd like to think of it this way, that the bottom of the architecture is not a straight line. It's going up and down, and I guess over the years it would generally get deeper, but it doesn't have to go down to a particular level and be there. So that's the way I think about it. What else we got? We still got time. We still have lots of people with us by the look of it, so we just keep going until everyone drops out, eh?
We still have many questions here, Roger. I think some of the questions are more related to enterprise architecture and the business architecture. Let me combine these questions together. I see one of the question Andrew has asked and few other colleagues have asked about, can we specify product and service development or sales or delivery on our architecture? So I think we are talking more in terms of the enterprise architecture, but you can give more clarity on it.
Okay.
Do you find it useful to include product, service, development, sales, and delivery separated like Rumler process architecture for the core processes?
So let me answer two questions there. I hope it was what you were asking. One of them certainly is. In terms of enterprise architecture, my world is about process architecture. Mm-hmm. And I see that as an important central part of enterprise architecture. So, and it depends what people call enterprise architecture, of course, but the usual suspects, we would have applications and information and systems and maybe people and facilities and business rules and services, all of those kinds of artifacts of enterprise architecture, or indeed, further still, artifacts of some sort of operating model for an organization. Now, for me, you remember from last time, if you were with us, I speak about what I think is the first principle of process-based management. It's called the primacy of process. And all of those other things, applications and information, all the rest of it, of course, are important. We need them. But we need them only because we want to execute and manage processes. So I think of process-centric enterprise architecture. And the graphic way I think about that, and I don't do much more than draw this diagram, is to say, yes, we've got all of those other artifacts of enterprise architecture. I would put them in a circle and put process in the middle, the primacy of process. Our organization executes its strategy via its processes, and it uses all of those really important things to be able to do that, but it does it via the processes. So that's my highest level view of where process architecture fits into enterprise architecture. I think process is central to everything. Now, you asked about products and services. If we've built our process architecture and we can't see how products and services are getting produced by the core processes, then there's something wrong with the architecture. So if we thought about the hospital, because it's on the screen in front of us, what is it that comes out of that? Well, it's the products and services we're offering. We could make a big long list of them, and we should be able to see them in there at lower levels, if not at this level. So the core processes are all about how we deliver products and services. So you could do a nice little matrix of processes. Perhaps you'd need to go down another level or two. So maybe you've got 3 levels of core process against actual products you deliver. Product Gizmo XYZ Model 3, and they could be the columns, and you could, if you wanted to, go through and say which processes are involved in creating, distributing, maintaining, whatever, that product, if you want to. And maybe it's a way of testing the completeness of the architecture. I don't do that a lot myself. It gets a bit tedious, and I don't know that you benefit a lot, but you can do it. You can certainly map that. But it should be obvious to you, just looking at the process architecture, where the products and services are coming from. Did I answer the question properly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Roger.
Okay.
I got thanks also from the user, one of the user. Okay.
Enterprise architecture.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Once we develop our strategy and value proposition, when we build a process architecture, isn't it sensible to start at the delivery end of the value stream and work backwards to start of the value stream?
Well, in a sense we do. Now, keep in mind that when I'm talking about building a process architecture, in elapsed time, that's maybe 4 or 5 weeks. So we're not talking about months and months and months. But we do really start at the delivery end, because we say, what do we promise and to whom? So, what are we delivering? But we're not saying, we don't start out at the hospital to say, okay, how do we do x-rays? No, it's genuinely top down. And we'll get to, provide X-ray service somewhere. That's a process somewhere at some lower level for sure. But that's not where we're going to start. That's that bottom-up kind of piece. But there's nothing, we start at start where we need to end here. When we're talking about from moving from the architecture, from the strategy to the architecture, we're doing this. Remember, we're back at the university. This piece here, we said, what are the value propositions, and let's turn those into high-level processes. And that's inherently about what services are we delivering and to whom.
Okay, Roger, we have increased the time to 20 minutes. Would you still like to continue, or we can take these questions and...
I can go all day. I don't mind. It's up to you. And I mean, we still have 48 people.
Yeah.
My screen is right.
Yeah, absolutely.
But no one's got anything to do. So,
so let's
we had 52 before. So yeah.
Okay. So can you share your experience?
But by the way, I'm happy to take all of these questions later and do answers for them. That'd be an interesting exercise to do. Might take me a week to get it all done by the sound of it, but whether we've answered them or not, it might be good to collate them and put something together. That might be a nice paper. Yeah,
so sure. As we said to all the participants, all questions are welcome. They can write their questions to us, and we all will get back to them with the required information. Let's take last 3 more questions, Roger, for this session. Yeah. Okay. So the first one, can you share your experience on top 3 process architecture Fox paths that you have witnessed?
Yep. Okay. So the 3 things that people most often get wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So I think number 1 would be trying to build a process architecture that looks like the org chart. Doesn't happen on my projects because I don't let it happen. But if you build a process architecture in which you can easily see all the various pieces of the organization, then there's something wrong with the org chart. It's not cross-functional, it's functional. And sometimes you'll have very senior people, I've had this happen, very senior people who just don't get it. They really want to see their department as a core process or something. You might also have a problem. Sometimes people don't like the idea of being a support process. So the director of IT services can't possibly imagine how what they do isn't core. You couldn't exist without us. Okay, that's a misunderstanding of the whole architecture. We don't have unimportant processes. If we find an unimportant process, we'll get rid of it, stop doing it. So I think that's important as well. And then I think the other one, it's probably lots, but another one that comes to mind readily, so perhaps it happens too often, is people try and make it perfect because they intend to get it approved by the board or by the executive committee or someone, at which point you can't change it anymore. Now, you don't want an architecture that you can't change. You don't want to be changing it a lot all the time, but it will change. The more you drill down, you'll think about it some more, you'll get a better word here and there. So it needs to be controlled and managed in a nicely stable way, of course, but it's not fixed. So I think they'd be the three that come immediately to mind. So our next one, this one, does architecture support us in identifying the value creation approaches?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a question?
Yeah.
Not sure if I understand the question. Can you help me with that? Value creation approaches, what are we talking?
Does architecture support us in identifying the value creation approaches?
What's an example of a value creation approach?
Actually, with the help of the architecture, we discuss with we understand what is your value that an organization would like to deliver to their customers. What are their commitment to their customers?
Sure.
And then we build all the building blocks of the organization in terms of what are the processes required to deliver those values. That's what we do in architecture. I think this is what the gentleman is looking for it. Is there anything else that you are specifically that you are looking for this question? What we are understanding is that as an architecture, we see that how the value that can be delivered by an organization, what are the processes required. That's how the architecture is created. Roger, there is one question regarding should we expect processes at the third level down to connect to downstream processes in a specific manner?
I don't know about in a specific manner. I mean, all processes connect to some other process. You know, if in a modelling sense, and at level 2 or the third or fourth level down, you're going to start doing, you know, BPMN or EPCs or something, detailed modelling. But in any architecture, there is no ultimate process. You know, even our own processes connect into customer processes or broker processes or someone. So everything connects. If we're talking about the details of when we start doing clever BPMN modelling and whatever, then you know more about that than I do, Amit. That's not my caper.
So Roger, every organization, when they define their business architecture, they define the architecture conventions based on their requirements. So for example, some of the companies, they define the process level from level 3 onwards. In some of the organizations, they define their process level from 4 onwards. Like in case of Toyota, they even move till 6. So depending on the organization, and like the example, Matthew, that you have used for SIPOC diagram actually, as you all understand it, it gives a complete picture, a very high level information about the process. So normally we use SIPOC at the time of the process architecture to get the overall understanding about what value that we are committing to deliver. So what are the different building blocks which are required, like in terms of input, high level processes, and so on. So these use as an input. But from level 3 onwards, it is more specific business processes that we use and link it with the architecture.
Yep. So this is to do with modelling conventions, and I appreciate that organisations have such things, and you need them. You need to know what a model should look like at various levels to make it consistent, etc. And that's obviously important. And you need to start your model repository from this high level. Somehow. Now that'll depend on your modelling conventions and perhaps a little on your modelling tool, but there's some sort of entry-level model type at the top to give you the connectivity you need right from the top, that you can locate them down. But, you know, as I keep pointing, the work that I'm doing and
So
what we're talking about here is managing processes. Modeling is an important part of that. But it's not my area of expertise. But you certainly do need to marry them up. But I see organisations do this all the time, and it doesn't seem to be difficult. But you need to have modelling conventions, that's for sure.
Okay. Roger, we'll take the last question of this webinar, and I request all the participants, please drop your questions to us, and we will get in touch with you with all the required information. So last question, if I take it in the same series, once we develop our strategy and value proposition, when we start building our process architecture, is it sensible to start at the delivery end or the value stream and work backward to the start? This one, we have already, I think this is again, same, we have covered this.
Yeah, we did that, didn't we?
Yeah, there's another. So when you are defining a BPM strategy at an enterprise level, would it also not require process mining, execution, data integration, business intelligence reporting? How
Sure. I would still want to start at the top and understand what the value propositions and high-level processes, but at some point you could very usefully be doing that kind of process mining and do something of a bottom-up approach, but just be very careful that you don't end up with a siloed process architecture. Okay. But I mean, you don't have to, but yeah, I mean, we don't have to, let's make life as easy as possible for ourselves, but just make sure all the time that our processes have got line of sight back to the strategy.
All right. So thank you very much, Roger. Some of these questions we will we'll take care, we'll reply them with the information. Thanks each one of you for your participation. Please feel free, drop an email with all your questions. Due to time constraint, we are already overshooting 30 minutes from our planned schedule. So please feel free, write to us, and it will be a pleasure to reply all of you. Our next webinar is next Friday, same time, same place. Of course, please register for active process management. Some of the questions that you have discussed about how to measure the effectiveness of business architecture, those are some of the questions that will also be taken in more detail in our next session on active process management, process measurement and governance, that we are going to take care of it. So thank you so much for your participation. Look forward to connect with you again. Till the time, stay safe, stay happy. Roger, thank you very much for today's session once again.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you next week.